Is it on? Is it? Can you hear me? It was muted. Okay, fair enough. Well, happy July 2nd. To just follow up, my father taught American history for like 26 years, so I have a lot of it just innately ingrained into my brain that I can't get out. So historically speaking, when the Continental Congress met about the Declaration of Independence, they formed a committee, which was headed by John Adams, and on the committee included Benjamin Franklin, and of course Thomas Jefferson famously was the secretary. And so then they met, and they went over the various articles that were going to be in the Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson was the one who wrote everything down. And then they went before the Congress, and it was Jefferson who read the articles to Congress, and then they voted on each line. And that's famously where Jefferson read the line about how slavery was a great evil, and then the Congress vetoed the article, so it was strict. So it doesn't appear in the final draft. And then it was up to Jefferson as the secretary to put all the things together and write what we know as the Declaration of Independence. Well, the Congress convened on July 2nd to vote for the ratification of the Declaration. Now, not everyone was present. Some of them voted in absentia, some of them just were out of town or whatever. But the motion passed and was ratified on July 2nd. But they wanted to hold a signing ceremony. But because not everyone was there, they decided to delay it until everyone could be there. So they waited 2 days. So the ceremony was held on July 4th. Well, it was not until after the war when, I don't know how long after the war, but they held the first national July 4th Independence Day celebration. And when John Adams found out that they were holding it on the 4th to honor the ceremony, he was not very happy. And we actually have letters from him complaining about it, saying, how dare you hold it on the 4th? Don't they know that the actual day was the 2nd? But it has gone down, and the 4th is now our national holiday, at the consternation of John Adams. So he was not happy about that. But anyway, so happy Independence Day. I know it's the 2nd, but that's the correct one. So, completely shifting gears, we will be in Hebrews 5, although we're not actually in Hebrews 5. We'll be in Hebrews 4:14, and we're not actually going to cover all of chapter 5. We're going to cover 4:14 through 5:10, which is pretty widely accepted as a complete unit, even though it's not an exact chapter in our Bibles. So I'll begin. Seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. For we have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly into the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Chapter 5. For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins, who can have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way, for that he himself also is compassed with infirmity. And by reason hereof he ought, as for the people, so also for himself to offer for sins, and no man taketh his honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron. So also Christ glorified not himself to be made a high priest, but he that said unto him, Thou art my son, today I have begotten thee. As he said also in another place, Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him. Called of God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So, this is the famous high priest section, and this is where, oh boy, everyone gets all excited because we get to talk about Melchizedek. Well, don't get too excited because we're going to talk about Melchizedek a lot, because he comes up a lot, more than you would probably want to, but anyway. So, to summarize, Chapter 1 is basically the author of Hebrews arguing how Jesus is superior to the angels, and that the revelation he has given us is greater than the revelations given us by angels. Then in chapter 2, he follows this up by explaining how Jesus became the perfect Son of Man, and how he fulfills that role in relation to being greater than the angels. In chapter 3, we then get how Jesus is superior to Moses. This leads into chapter 4, where he explains how Jesus has led us into a period of rest where Moses didn't, right? Moses failed. He didn't actually get them into the promised land, but Jesus succeeded. And now we get to chapter 5, where I know it's going to be called it's the high priest section, but to keep it consistent and to go with my flow, this is him arguing that Jesus is superior to Aaron. And Aaron does appear. So in verse 14, we begin, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God." So in order to begin, we have to understand what the high priest is. We also have to understand what the role of priest means and the significance of the role of priest. So when we get to the story of Moses and Aaron, right, in the book of Exodus, we see the first major division of power in the body of Israel. In order to explain this, I have to first cover what the division of power is. So once we get into Israel as a nation properly, we see three branches of government emerge. The first, of course, is the king branch. The king is responsible for executing justice, as well as maintaining the military. They're in charge of national defense. The second are the priests. They're the ones who take care of the law. They're the ones who maintain the law. They're the ones who offer sacrifices. They maintain the cult. They work at the temple, and so on. And then finally, there are the prophets. And the prophets are the ones who speak directly to God. And you have what's similar, again, I don't want to make too strong of a comparison to our current government, but you do have something similar to a checks and balance system, where the king is in charge of, I'll say, political authority, although that's not exactly a fair distinction, whereas the priests are in charge of the religion and the religious authority. And then you have the prophets, and the prophet's job is if the king or the priests are out of line, God tells the prophets, and the prophets tell the king or the priest, right? So that's how they kind of keep each other in check. And but originally, right, all authority was given to Moses. But then almost immediately, God makes a clear distinction between the role of Moses, who is functioning similarly to king and prophet, right? He has all the political authority, he has all the military authority, he's the one who communes directly with God, even when Aaron and Miriam both complain about that. Like, why does only Moses get to talk to God? And God's like, don't question it. So Moses functions as a king figure, even though he doesn't have a crown, as well as the prophet. Whereas Aaron takes on all of the priestly functions, he and his descendants. Once we get into the promised land, right, the role of military authority falls to the judges, and then historically speaking, it's not until we get to Samuel where we see the very clear distinctions between the three major branches. So Samuel's the one who anoints Saul as king. Samuel becomes the first prophet in an official sense. And then, of course, the priestly line is still maintained through the descendants of Aaron. But we're talking about the high priest. So what does the high priest do? Well, to give context, the best place to go is Leviticus 16. So I'm going to read just bits and pieces of it. So beginning in verse 2, the Lord said to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron that he may not come whenever he wants into the holy place behind the veil in front of the mercy seat on the ark, or else he will die, because I appear in the cloud above the mercy seat. Aaron will present the bull for his sin offering and make atonement for himself and his household. When Aaron presents the bull for his sin offering and make atonement for himself and his household, he will slaughter the bull for his sin offering. Then he must take a fire pan full of fiery coals from the altar before the Lord and 2 handfuls of finely ground fragrant incense and bring them inside the veil. He is to put the incense on the fire before the Lord so that the cloud of incense covers the mercy seat that is over the testimony, or else he will die. He is to take some of the bull's blood and sprinkle it with his finger against the east side of the mercy seat. Then he will sprinkle some of the blood with his finger before the mercy seat 7 times. He will purify the place, most holy, in this way for all the sins because of the Israelites' impurities and rebellious acts. He will do the same for the tent of meeting that remains among them, because it is surrounded by their impurities. No one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement in the most holy place until he leaves after he has made atonement for himself, his household, and the whole assembly. Then he will go out to the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement for it. He is to take some of the bull's blood and some of the goat's blood and put it on the horns of all sides of the altar. He is to sprinkle some of the blood on it with his finger 7 times to cleanse it and set it apart from the Israelites' impurities. So, here we have the main duties of the high priest. First off, the high priest is allowed to go into the Holy of Holies 1 day a year. He is not allowed to go any other time. There's only a very specific designated time when he can go into the Holy of Holies and make absolution on behalf of the entire congregation. He makes atonement, right? He makes the atonement offering for himself, for his family, which are the Levites, and for the community, for the entire Israel. He does other things as well, but these are probably his most important duties, right? He goes into the Holy of Holies, he can pass the veil, and he makes the atonement offering on the Day of Atonement. So as the author of Hebrews says here, we have a great high priest, right? And he says, one who passed through the heavens. And I think that this is rather significant, right? Because Aaron, if we take him as the sort of archetype of what a high priest is supposed to be, he went into the Holy of Holies, interceding on behalf of Israel, but he is still physical. He's doing it on our plane of existence. So if God is in heaven, we are here on earth, Aaron is still on earth, going up to the veil and making intercession on this side, right? Whereas Jesus isn't doing that, right? Jesus tore the veil. He is now in heaven, and he is now acting as high priest in heaven. He's on the other side of the veil. He is doing what Aaron couldn't. He has access that Aaron didn't. He is in a greater position than Aaron ever was. So then he continues, let us then hold fast to the confession. And he's brought this up multiple times, the confession of our faith. I keep going back to Philippians 2, 6 through 11. I think that it's about as good as any place in the New Testament to understand the basic confession. Who existed in the form of God did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. Instead, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a servant, taking on the likeness of humanity. And when he had come as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even to the death of a cross. For this reason, God exalted him and gave him the name that's above every name, so that the name of Jesus every knee will bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So, Jesus is currently functioning as our high priest. He is a priest greater than Aaron, and he is now making intercession for us through the veil, through the heavens, and because of this, we should hold to our confession, right? So then in verse 15, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. I mentioned at the end of chapter 2, this briefly, but it bears repeating, that there's a difference between our uses of the word sympathy and empathy. That sympathy is basically having an emotional experience that is similar to, but not the same as someone else's. So if someone were to lose a child, and they're grieving over the loss of a child, and you go, well, I know what that's like, I lost a dog. Well, I mean, it's loss, right? There's a scene in Home Alone, right, when the mom realizes that she's left her child behind, and then Frank, the uncle who's never quite there, he goes, oh, I know what you're going through. I forgot my glasses. It's like, they're not the same thing, right? But we do not have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tested in every way as we are, yet without sin. So it's not that he can't sympathize with us, right? He can go beyond that. He actually knows what it's like to be human. He can empathize with us. He actually understands our weaknesses on a personal level. He understands what we've gone through because he has done it. So to empathize is to share an experience because you've gone through the same thing. So if someone says they lost a child and you've lost a child, that is something you can bond with. You can make that connection on a personal level. Then verse 16. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness. This is one of the most powerful verses in the Bible. And I think that we tend to overlook it, or at least we don't really consider the ramifications of it. In the Old Testament times, right? Only the high priest was allowed to stand before God, and it was only one day of the year, on the Day of Atonement. The high priest on that day would make intercession for Israel. We don't have to wait, right? We don't need a high priest to make the intercession on our behalf. We don't have to wait one day a year. We currently have the privilege to stand before the Almighty, and when we pray, our prayers go directly to the Father. There is no intermediary. We don't need priests, despite what Catholics do. The implication is that they don't even go through Jesus anymore. Like, we go directly to God the Father, although I realize God and Jesus are the same, so the Trinity, I understand. This is a freedom and an honor that I'm not sure we really think about as much as we should. This is pretty tremendous from a theological and just phenomenal perspective. So that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us at the proper time. This is probably something that you've heard explained in some context or another, but it doesn't hurt to cover briefly. So there is a distinction between mercy and grace. And it seems to be fairly consistent in the Bible. There are different words in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Mercy is when you deserve punishment, right? You've done something bad. You're a child and you were told not to play ball in the house, and you break the lamp, right? You deserve to be punished. You deserve whatever the typical punishment is. But instead of the punishment, you're given some sort of leniency. That's mercy, right? You deserve punishment, but you don't get it. Grace is when you don't deserve punishment, but you don't really deserve the blessing. You haven't done anything to earn it. Because that's different, right? You've earned the blessing. You've worked for it. You have done some extraordinary feat that deserves merit. Now, grace is when the person in authority, the person who has the power to bestow blessings, just goes, I want to do something nice for that person for no reason whatsoever. Parents do this for children. You know, you're just one day like, no, I want to do something nice for my child. The child hasn't done anything to deserve it. They certainly haven't done anything not to deserve it. They haven't done anything to deserve a punishment or whatever. You just want to do good things for the sake of doing good things. So, and we see this in the Bible, right? There are plenty of times when God should dole out punishments, but he doesn't. That's mercy. And there are times when God just does good things to do good things, right? Israel, or whoever the subject is, doesn't deserve it, but they don't not deserve it. God just does it. We see this like in Psalm 23, goodness and mercy, right? Will follow me. So then we actually get into chapter 5 properly. For every high priest taken from men is appointed in service to God for the people, to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. And here the author of Hebrews is laying out in fairly concise sentence the main duties of the priest. And this is most commentaries recognize, although they highlight different things or their lists are slightly different depending on how many points they want to make of it. But I'm going to talk about 5 points in this verse. So the first is the priest is appointed, right? Every high priest is appointed from the men. So it's not something that you can just declare yourself. You can't just one day say, I want to be a priest. It doesn't work that way. God has to declare you to be a priest. Second, it is an appointment to serve God, right? That's the whole point of the priesthood, right? You're actually serving God. Third is, as part of the responsibilities, you're not just serving God, you are doing it on behalf of the people, on behalf of the congregation. So you're appointed to serve God on behalf of others. And then the last 2 things, of course, is that priests make offerings and they make sacrifices. And these are different things. It's very clear in the Old Testament. Offerings and sacrifices are 2 different things. So offerings are usually Thanksgiving offerings. They're a way of thanking God. They're a way of giving to God. Sometimes it's from obligation, but it's not because of anything wrong you've done. It's not to make atonement. It's not to ask for pardon. It's not to cover over your sins, whereas sacrifices are. Where the sacrifices, you have done something wrong, and you need to make atonement, right? You've sinned, or you've committed some sort of transgression, and therefore you need to offer a bull or a lamb or a goat or doves or whatever in order to have your sins pardoned. So, and the priests, which this would be an awful, awful job when you think about it, their job almost all day is to accept these gifts, right? They accept the peace offerings and they accept the sacrifices. And they have to hurt them and kill them and prepare them and smoke them and all the good stuff. And they just do it all day long. You know, the fires are always going and the blood is always flowing, and it's just, it would be awful. And of course, and this is going to be the point of the whole chapter, that Christ fulfills all of these roles, that he did all of these things. So then in chapter 2, he is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he is also subject to weakness. So it's interesting that he includes this, because when we think about priests and the high priest, what we usually associate them with is the duties, the performance that they do, like taking the offerings and the sacrifices, and making atonement and going into the Holy of Holies, taking care of the temple, taking care of the tabernacle, and so on. We just think of the performance side of it. But there's actually a lot more to what the priests did than that. One of the best examples of this, one of the best verses of this, is in Deuteronomy 33:10, where it actually says, they being the Levites, will teach your ordinances to Jacob and your instruction to Israel. They will set incense before you and whole burnt offerings on your altar. One of the things that we find out, it's kind of indirectly, but that the Levites were responsible for creating basically like little schools. And it was expected that people at various times would go to learn Torah, right? The Levites would set up these little places where you could go and hear the Bible and be taught what the law says. Right? Because how else would you find out? Well, it's the job of the Levites to instruct them. So, you know, the Levites, they did a lot more than just killing animals, although that was a big part of it. So, what the author of Hebrews is highlighting here in verse 2 is that part of the role of the priest is to empathize with the people and to teach them, which Jesus obviously did. And he teaches them, which would mostly refer to the Torah, but as well as help them in a spiritual sense, help them from going astray. Then in verse 3, because of this, he must make a sin offering for himself as well as for the people. So, at the beginning of verse 6, at the beginning of Leviticus 16, it does say that that Aaron, when he first, I'm trying to get my thoughts together. At the beginning of Leviticus 16, before Aaron can make the atonement offering for Israel, he first has to make an atonement offering for himself. Because as a high priest, he's committed sins, right? He's still human. And once he's atoned for himself, then he has to atone for the priests, because they sin. And only once he has been declared guiltless, and the priests have been declared guiltless, can he finally make the offering for all of Israel and make Israel guiltless until they go and sin 5 seconds later. So this is just part of what the priest has to do. They make offerings on behalf of themselves as well. Obviously, Jesus didn't sin, but this is all part of the responsibility of the high priest. Then in verse 4, which is, I don't know, I find it almost amusing the way he says this. No one takes this honor on himself. Instead, a person is called by God, just as Aaron was. The impression here is that no one in their right mind wants to be a priest. It's a horrible, horrible job, right? I mean, you're working with animals, you're killing animals, it's a thankless job. We also get the impression in the New Testament that no one should want to be a pastor, that it's a very high calling with a very high obligation, and the responsibility as well as the penalties are very severe. It's something that you should only do because God has called you, and you're doing it out of obligation, out of respect for God. And just to really hammer that point, and I'm curious how many of you are really familiar with this verse. Well, verses. In Genesis 49, we get the blessing of Levi. So 49:5. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Okay, this is Jacob's blessing on Levi. Their knives are vicious weapons. May I never enter into their council. May I never join their assembly. For in their anger they kill men, and on a whim they hamstring oxen. Their anger is cursed, for it is strong, and their fury is cruel. I will disperse them throughout Jacob and scatter them throughout Israel. That doesn't sound like a blessing to me. It's not. It's a curse. Levi being the priesthood is a curse. That is why they don't have land. Levites are not allowed to own land because this is part of the curse of Jacob. What's hilarious is I didn't bother to look it up, but I remember I had to take a class on intertestamental literature, and there are so many pieces of intertestamental literature where they're talking about the priesthood and the foundation of the priesthood. And almost every time it comes up, it talks about how Levi was elevated over the other tribes and how Levi is blessed beyond the other tribes, and that's why they were made the priests. That is not what Genesis says. The reason why the Levites are the priests, are because they are cursed and because no one else wants to do it. And this is a thankless, horrible job wherein you are not allowed to own land. You're not allowed to just do whatever you want. I want to be a hunter or a farmer or a whatever. You're stuck working at the temple. Yes? That's later. So that's after he's been given the high priest position. But I can't remember what chapter it is. But you have people in Israel who are not happy with him as high priest, and they want him disposed. And when that happens, they have other candidates that they're considering to replace him with. And so Moses calls on God and says, okay, God, here are the candidates. Who do you want to be high priest? And then Aaron's staff buds. And then that kind of settles the debate. I don't remember. I don't remember. That might be right. That sounds right. But no, Aaron had already been singled out as the high priest at this point, but Aaron did a lot of stupid stuff, and people weren't exactly happy with him. They weren't happy with Moses either. And so that whole episode was just God validating his choice for the high priest. So then in verse 5, we have, in the same way, the Messiah did not exalt himself to become high priest. So again, the high priesthood, or the priesthood and the high priest, is not something you're supposed to want for yourself. I was trying to look into this, and it was not easy. But during the Hellenistic period, right, so after we get out of the Old Testament times, we know that Alexander takes over basically the world, and the Greeks started exercising influence on everyone, including the priesthood. And we know that at least at one time, the priesthood was subverted, where the Greeks, whoever was in charge at the time, I don't know, he instituted a Benjaminite as high priest, which again, Levi's supposed to be high priest. Not just Levites, but people from the line of Aaron. And there is suspicion that maybe more than one priest was installed who was not from the line of Levi. You try typing it in. How many priests were not Levites? And all you get are, priests could only be Levites. Well, yeah, according to the Bible, that's true, but that's not what happens necessarily, especially when we get into the Greek and Roman periods. And this gets really complicated when we get into the Roman period, because Rome, of course, has taken over everything. And we know that a lot of the high priests who are in power during the New Testament period are sympathetic to Rome, and some of them have probably been put in power because of Rome, right? Because Rome wants their puppets running the show. And there are suspicions that Caiaphas may not have been a Levite, which that's something. Because again, Rome wants their priests in authority. So the point is that the author of Hebrews here is saying that you're not supposed to want to be a priest, and you're not supposed to want to be the high priest. This is something that God appoints, and God determines who's going to be running the religion. But it's obvious that at this point, the priesthood is very powerful. It's very lucrative, because religion is powerful and lucrative. And the Romans want their people in charge in order to control the populace. And people are gunning for the position, right? People want it. So what the religion has become right now is clearly not what's supposed to be. Again, he doesn't spell all of this out, but I don't think it's too much of a stretch to point that out. And again, I think multiple things can be true at once. That not only is Jesus, as the author here, comparing Jesus to Aaron and contrasting Jesus to Aaron, but he might also be, there might be some subtle commentary on the current state of religion, what the priesthood has become in their time, even though he doesn't really spell it out and we don't have too much information to go on. So, but again, and obviously we know that Jesus didn't necessarily want the role that was given to him, and he'll talk about that in a little bit more. So then he goes on, well, in the same way the Messiah did not exalt himself to become high priest, but the one who said to him, the one of course being God, "You are my son, today I have become your father." So this again is a reference back to Psalm 2. He's done this before. We know that Jesus was reluctant to take on the role that God wanted him to. And here's as good place as any to stop and ask the question, how can Jesus be the high priest? Especially if I just said that part of the problem possibly with, especially the conservative Jews, the traditional Jews, that they might have with the current priestly establishment is the high priest can only be a Levite, and not just a Levite, but someone from the line of Aaron, right? And if you have priests who aren't of the line of Aaron, we know like Caiaphas was not of the line of Aaron, he might not have been a Levite, like this is a lot of problems, right? And so if the author of Hebrews here is saying that Jesus is not only the high priest, but he is the superior high priest, he is the superior high priest, he's the one that we wanted all along, how can he be the superior high priest if he's not a Levite? How do we know he's not a Levite? Well, because Matthew and Luke tell us he's not a Levite, right? He's from Judah. He's descended from David. He's from the tribe, the kingly tribe, not the priestly tribe. So this appears to be rather complicated. So his answer is, the answer he kind of starts to form begins in verse 6. Also in another passage, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And now we get the reference to Melchizedek. Oh boy. So this is a quote from Psalm 110, and this is where we get really excited and where some discussions tend to go off the rails about who Melchizedek is and why he's significant. Again, this is going to come up multiple times. So to begin, to give some sort of context, in Genesis 13, Abram, who's not yet Abraham, and Lot, right, his nephew, they decide to go their separate ways. Then in 14, Lot, like the idiot he is, gets kidnapped. So Abram, a 90-year-old geriatric man, leads an Arnold Schwarzenegger-style commando raid on the kidnappers. What's your excuse? If a 90-year-old man can do this, you all should be able to. So Abram, in this raid, ends up killing the kidnappers. He frees the hostage, and we have this, again, this very epic sort of night raid. And then Genesis 14 ends with one of the strangest accounts in Genesis, and that's saying something. So beginning in verse 17, after Abram returned and defeated, I'm going to get his name wrong, Chedorlaomer, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest to God Most High. He blessed him and said, Abram is blessed by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And I give praise to God Most High, who has handed over your enemies to you. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Then the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the people, but take the possessions for yourselves. Right, so you freed the hostages, let me have the hostages, I'll take care of them, and you get to take all the loot. Right. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand in an oath to Yahweh, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or sandal strap or anything that belongs to you, so that you can never say, I made Abram rich. He doesn't want to be accused that the reason why he's wealthy is because he's out stealing, or that he's plundering, that he's gotten himself rich by stealing from thieves, right? Because the people he just killed, a bunch of like pirates, right? They're marauders. They're going around looting and killing and pillaging, and he doesn't want to be accused of taking things that have already been taken. He wants to give it back to the people that it was taken from. So in verse 24, I will take nothing except what the servants have eaten, but as for the share of men who came with me, Honor, Eshcol, and Mamre, they can take their share. So, and of course he famously gives 10% of his wealth to Melchizedek, which establishes the tradition of the tithe. So we get this question, and it's a rather frustrating question. Who on earth is this king of Salem? And people like to point out that Melchizedek, the name, Melchizedek, means righteous king, and Salem means peace. So he is the righteous king and the king of peace. I'd like to play all kinds of significant games, the meaning of the names, and there have even people try to propose that this is some sort of theophany, even though the text doesn't really warrant that too much. It is widely agreed that Salem here is a very early reference to Jerusalem. So Salem means peace, salam, and Jerusalem is city, so city of peace. Melchizedek is probably just the guy's name. We know that Melech and Zedek, Melchizedek, Melech, Zedek, both occur in other names in the Bible. So, for example, we have Abimelech, which means my father is king. We have Elimelech, God is king. And we have Zedekiah, which is righteous is God, or righteous is Yahweh. But even if Melchizedek is a person, that creates other problems. Yay. Because the text presents him as priest to the God Most High. This would almost certainly be Yahweh. So how can God have a priest, let alone a high priest, if Abraham was the first true worshiper? I don't know. I don't have an answer. But this is who Melchizedek is, right? He's this priest who just appears out of nowhere in Genesis 14, along with the king of Sodom, and Abraham recognizes that he's a great man. In fact, he accepts the blessing of Melchizedek and then gives him 10% of his wealth as a sign of respect. So, just to connect, because Melchizedek only appears in two places. We get him in this one snippet of a story in Genesis 14, but then we also get a mention in Psalm 110. So I'm going to read the Psalm 110 just for context. So verse 1, "This is the declaration of the Lord, to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." So this first verse is really, really fun. And it has tons of commentary. We see it quoted in the New Testament a couple of times because of how, I don't want to use the word convoluted, but how confusing this first verse is. So, just to clarify, in this first verse, there are three people being discussed, right? So, just to clarify. So, imagine me, and just for point of comparison, think I'm standing in for David. Okay, I'm David. And then I'm going to point to Brother Gary here, and he is God. This is for comparison only. So, in verse 1, it begins, "This is the declaration of Yahweh," not just Lord, right? This is the problem with using Lord for everything, because we get confused. So, Yahweh, I'm pointing to Mr. Gary here, "Yahweh said to me," David, "to talk to my Lord." Right? This is the declaration of Yahweh to my Lord. David is referring to someone else as Lord. In fact, this is brought up multiple times in the New Testament. Who on earth is David calling Lord if it's not Yahweh? Because he already said Yahweh spoke to me, and now I'm talking to somebody else. So not only is there three people in this verse, but David recognizes that two of the three, right, because he's the third, are of higher station than David. David, who's the king. That kind of narrows it down, right? Like, if Yahweh's already been mentioned, and there's someone else that David's calling Lord, who could that possibly be? And of course, the Christian interpretation has to be it's messianic, right? He's looking forward to Jesus. I mean, it makes sense, obviously. I mean, it's a compelling argument, but it is still curious. Like, why is David phrasing it this way? Continuing on. "The Lord," that's Yahweh, "will extend your mighty scepter," presuming he's talking about whoever this other Lord is, right? This imaginary Lord that he's talking about. "Rule over your surrounding enemies. Your people will volunteer on your day of battle. In holy splendor from the womb of the dawn, the dew of your youth belongs to you. The Lord, Yahweh, has sworn an oath, and he will not take it back. Forever you are a priest like Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will crush kings on the day of his anger. He will judge the nations, heaping up corpses. He will crush leaders over the entire world. He will drink from the brook of the road. Therefore, he will lift up his head." I think the traditional interpretation, if you don't go messianic, is that this might have been a reference to Solomon. That if David wrote it, that he's thinking about Solomon and he's looking forward to what Solomon will become. that Solomon will not only take over as king, but that he will become a king greater than David. That's why he calls him my Lord. Like, he'll be... And Solomon, for the most part, pretty much succeeds David, right? He expands the territory. He makes Israel very wealthy, very powerful. He built the temple. So it's not hard to see it that way. And it's also easy to see how it becomes Christological, right? How it becomes messianic. Because obviously David, or assuming it is David, that he is looking forward to a future king who is going to surpass him. And he, again, makes this very cryptic reference in verse 4, that this future king, right, this one who will replace David, is going to be like Melchizedek. So what does that mean, that we are going to have a king like Melchizedek? Or I say we, Israel have a king like Melchizedek. So there seems to be three key features to this comparison, right, that this future king will become Melchizedek, or be like Melchizedek. One is that he is going to predate the law, that he is going to function in a way that works outside of how the law currently works. So Melchizedek was a priest before there was a law, and this priest is going to function in a way that is contrary to what's established by the law, because the law currently, as looking at David's time period, the law is very specific on what a priest is and what a priest can and can't do. However, this new priest, this new kind of priest, is going to be something different. To build on that, second point, he is not from a priestly order. He is not Levitical. He is someone who will have to be appointed by God, just like Melchizedek. Melchizedek, presumably, did not inherit the role of priest, but was made priest by God. At least that's what we have to assume from the text. And then finally, and this is the most important thing, we have a priest who is also king, because Melchizedek was king of Salem. So he had all the political authority, but he also had all the religious authority. He was priest and king at the same time. So David, presumably, is looking forward to a time when the new king, whether it's Solomon or some future king, whoever that could be, will not only take on the kingly duties, but will also take over the priestly duties, like Melchizedek. And just to twist the knife a little bit, this is what got Saul in trouble, right? Saul was king, and he tried to make offerings, which he wasn't supposed to do because that was for the priests. But didn't Solomon do it too? Did Solomon make offerings? Why is it okay for Solomon, but not okay for Saul? I don't know. Other than that, he's Solomon. Solomon is Solomon. It's at the dedication. He made an offering of dedication when the temple was first built. But still, it's like, I'm not sure kings are supposed to do that. Like, that's supposed to be the rule of the role of the Levites. But Solomon got away with it. So then in verse 7, we have, during his earthly life. Here the author is going to argue that while Jesus was still alive, so it's not just that Jesus now is functioning as a priest, we'll get to that, but that even while he was alive in his earthly ministry, he was already functioning like a priest. So he goes on. He offered prayers and appeals, supplications, which again is one of the main functions of the priest, that they intercede to God on our behalf. So the author is saying that Jesus, right, like a priest, was not only interceding for us, but he was praying on our behalf to God, which God heard, and in a way, these function in the same as offerings. So then he goes on, with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. Now, he doesn't give us too much more content than this. The logical connection, at least to me, it's hard to not see this as a reference to the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus was crying and pleading with God, don't take this away from me. He didn't want to do it. But it also seems like that the author of Hebrews is interpreting this as he is doing this on our behalf. So he's not just praying for his own sake, but he's also praying for our sake. How this works, he doesn't really clarify. He doesn't give us too much more than that. But then he finishes this with, and he was heard. So not only did he pray on our behalf and make intercession for us and make offertory prayers, but God actually heard him. And he was heard because of his reverence. I was going to pass over on this, but I just can't help myself, because this is a horse that I like to beat. Because this is what my dissertation was on. So, and I was surprised. It's shocking to me how, so my dissertation was on fear of God, specifically fear of God language in Ecclesiastes. And one of the most fascinating things about fear of God in biblical studies is fear of God appears everywhere in the Old Testament. It's a very common theme, particularly in wisdom literature. But it's not just wisdom literature, even though it's very hard to get people to recognize that it appears outside of wisdom literature, but that's a whole other story. However, despite the fact that it appears so prominently in the Old Testament, it appears very sparingly in the New. The word fear doesn't really occur all that often, at least not in relation to God. And this is very interesting, right? Why would something that's so common in the Old Testament now be fairly rare in the New Testament? And what's the correlation to this? And unfortunately, most New Testament scholars just kind of ignore this. Because fear of God's an Old Testament topic. Why would we bother with it? Now, the exception to this is when it comes to the book of Hebrews. For some reason, I have no idea why, Hebrew scholars, Hebrew commentaries love talking about the fear of God more than pretty much any other area of the New Testament. I don't know why. I have found 2 dissertations published and bound on fear of God on the fear of God language in Hebrews, which is a fairly specific topic. And normally you wouldn't see dissertations published on such a similar topic. So the problem is here, and you might be a little confused. Well, I don't see the word fear here. There's no fear of God in this verse. Right. So he was heard because of, my translation says reverence. Well, the word in Greek isn't actually fear. And the word fear in Greek is phobos, phobeo, where we get the word phobia, right? Like, hydrophobia or whatever. It's the word eusabeia. Eusabeia. Now, eusabeia in Greek basically means piety. That's just what it means. It means piety. Okay. And however, what's interesting is in the Old Testament, see, this is all getting complicated. In the Old Testament, eusabeia is used a few times to translate the Hebrew word of fear. And that's where we get this idea that fear means piety. That's really where it's come from. It's coming from this Greek influence. So we have this word here. Jesus was heard because of his eusabeia, which normally just means piety. But you have Hebrew scholars who have done their homework and they've done their digging, and they go, wait a second, eusabeia is used to translate fear in the Old Testament. So what if the author of Hebrews here doesn't actually mean piety? What if he actually means fear? Which, as someone who has done a dissertation on this, my thought is, well, just use the word fear then. Just use phobos, or just use something else. Like, why are you using this word that normally means piety? So, and the translations are all over the place. So the King James uses the word fear, New King James uses godly fear, ESV uses reverence, the Holman uses reverence, NIV uses reverent submission, that's fun. The NASB uses devout behavior. I found one translation that used devotion, one that used godliness, and the 95th edition of NASB uses piety, which is probably the best choice. But what's funny is, and I say funny, to me it's funny, is that commentaries actually, and they entertain it almost just to dismiss it, but they go, well, since eusabeia can mean fear, what if he's talking about the fear of death? Which is an insane question to ask. It really is, because eusabeia is never used that way. Fear of death, it doesn't make any sense. It means, if you're going to even use an occultic way, it'd be fear of God, right? Not fear of death. But it's just silly. It's really silly. But within this context, we do have this word that can mean fear of God, but it almost certainly just means piety, because of his piety, and because of his piety in the sense of devotion to God. And I think as someone who's, again, did a dissertation on this, I think reading much more than that into this would be unnecessary. But there you go. You can now feel free to forget all I just said. So in verse 8, though he was God's son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Now, what defines Jesus as the second person of the Trinity is his obedience, right? The Son submits to the will of the Father. And to say that Jesus learned obedience is odd language, and most commentaries acknowledge this. One commentary even admitted or pointed out that Jewish theologians have used this verse to substantiate the idea that Jesus was human and that he had to learn his obedience, as if to say he was not always obedient, but he had to perfect his obedience. And this is an example where we just need to let our theology kind of guide our interpretation. And I think it's probably true that what it means here is not that Jesus learned obedience, which is probably a very overtly, too literal of a reading, but that Jesus demonstrated his obedience, he proved his obedience, that through his obedience we learned or we became aware of his obedience through his suffering. So it's probably just awkward wording, especially as it comes through in translation. But yeah, I would be uncomfortable to say that Jesus had to learn how to be obedient, right? And that he at one time wasn't obedient would just kind of conflicts too much with other theology. But then in verse 9, after he was perfected, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. So again, with the word perfected, we've seen this earlier. Perfect is coming from telos. It's probably a word you've heard at some point before. I think I've even used it in one of the other earlier chapters. It means to be complete. So it probably means after his obedience was perfected or his obedience was completed or the work was completed, he became the sole source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. I don't think that it's a stretch to associate this with Jesus as the offering. Because what is the source of our salvation? Well, it's the fact that Jesus gave himself as the final sacrifice. And because we all see this elsewhere, that not only is Jesus high priest, but he is also the final sacrifice. He offered himself, and through his offering, through his suffering, we now have true atonement. We have final atonement. No more offerings need to be made. Then verse 10. And he was declared by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So now that he has gone through all of this, now that we've covered all this material, Christ is the high priest. He is the final high priest. He is the greatest high priest, however you want to say that. And what does it mean for him to be high priest? Well, first of all, it means he is now the one who stands beyond the veil. He isn't like Aaron, who has to stand in front of the veil or has to work within the veil, right? Because God is in heaven, or however you want to conceive of it. Rather, he has passed through. He is now standing before God in heaven, face to face. And he now intercedes on our behalf with God, face to face in heaven. He is not bound to the law. He fulfilled the law. And he doesn't have to function as in priestly capacity within the boundaries of the law. He did not inherit this role, but was appointed by God. And not only that, but he reigns simultaneously as priest and king. So, that's it.